Sometimes the loneliest moments come when we're surrounded by celebration. Lady Elowen knows this feeling well as she sits quietly at a winter wedding, her heart still aching from recent loss. She came to honor family, hoping to disappear into the crowd where a widowed woman of 55 could grieve in peace. But a drunken outlaw has other plans. He grabs her with cruel hands, thinking no one will stop him. He's wrong. In the shadows stands Lord Vaylen, a vampire who has watched over this family for centuries. When he sees Elowen's terror, old memories surface of another woman he failed to save long ago. This time will be different. This brute picked the wrong woman to harm and the wrong night to test an ancient creature's patience. What happens when centuries of regret finally meet the chance for redemption? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The great hall of Thornwick Castle stood as a testament to enduring nobility, its massive stone walls bearing witness to generations of celebrations and sorrows. Tonight, the ancient stones seemed to exhale warmth as hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows across tapestries that told stories older than memory. The Thornwick family crest, a silver phoenix rising from winter thorns, gleamed from every banner, and tonight it adorned the bride's dress as an ornate silver brooch, a symbol of the bloodline that had weathered countless storms. Lady Elowen Ashford adjusted the heavy wool of her late husband's cloak around her shoulders, the familiar weight both comfort and burden. At 55, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had loved deeply and lost profoundly. Her auburn hair, now streaked with silver like morning frost, was pulled back simply, without the elaborate styling favored by younger women. She wore her wedding ring still, a plain gold band that caught the firelight, though Edmund had been cold in the ground for 8 months now. She had come tonight only because duty demanded it. Margaret Thornwick, the bride, was her late husband's niece, and Edmund would have wanted family represented at such a joyous occasion. But joy felt foreign to Elowen now, like a language she had once spoken fluently, but could no longer quite remember. The bride herself radiated happiness that seemed to illuminate the entire hall. Margaret, barely 23, moved through the celebration like sunlight personified, her golden hair crowned with winter roses, her silk gown flowing like captured starlight. She had that particular glow of a woman deeply loved and cherished, something Elowen remembered from her own wedding day 3 decades past. The young woman's laughter rang clear above the music of lutes and drums, and even in her grief, Elowen found herself smiling at such pure delight. The groom, Sir William of Blackmore, was a man of perhaps 30 years with kind eyes and gentle hands that never left his bride's side for long. Elowen had watched him throughout the evening, noting how he anticipated Margaret's needs, how his gaze softened when it found her face. This was a marriage of love, not mere alliance, and such unions were precious enough to celebrate even when one's own heart was too broken to fully participate. The great hall buzzed with conversation from nearly 200 guests. Lords and ladies from neighboring holdings filled the long wooden tables, their fine clothing a rainbow of velvets and silks. Merchants and craftsmen sat at tables closer to the hearth, honored to witness noble festivities. Children darted between the adults like small sprites, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the deeper voices of their elders. At the head table, the immediate families presided over the feast. Lord Aldrich Thornwick, Margaret's father, stood periodically to offer toasts with his golden chalice raised high. His wife, Lady Cordelia, dabbed at tears of happiness with a delicate handkerchief. The groom's family had travelled from Blackmoor lands to the north, bringing gifts of silver and promises of lasting friendship between the houses. Elowen sat at a table, positioned respectfully near the family section, but not so close as to draw attention. She had specifically chosen a seat that would allow her to observe without being observed, to fulfill her duty while protecting her fragile emotional state. Around her sat other family connections, distant cousins, elderly aunts, family friends who spoke in measured tones about weather and harvests and anything but the absent husband who would never again escort her to such gatherings. The servants moved efficiently through the hall, carrying platters of roasted meats, fresh bread, and winter vegetables preserved from autumn's harvest. The kitchen had outdone itself tonight, presenting course after course of delicacies that filled the air with rich aromas. Wine flowed freely from barrels that had aged in the castle's deep cellars, and ale foamed in pewter mugs for those who preferred it. The abundance spoke to both celebration and the Thornwick family's prosperity. Musicians occupied a raised platform near the great fireplace, their instruments creating melodies that seemed to weave through conversation and laughter. A master storyteller had earlier regaled the assembly with tales of heroic deeds and ancient romances, his voice carrying easily through the vast space. Now, as the evening progressed toward dancing, the music shifted to livelier tunes that set feet tapping beneath the tables. Yet among all this revelry, Elowen noticed details that others might miss. The way Lady Cordelia's smile occasionally faltered when she thought no one was watching, perhaps thinking of her own mortality as she watched her daughter begin a new life. The manner in which Lord Aldrich's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his cup, age was it short, beginning to claim even this vital man. The young bride's momentary glances toward the empty chair where her beloved grandfather should have sat, lost to fever, just before harvest time. These observations came naturally to a woman who had learned to read faces and hearts through years of caring for others. Elowen had spent her marriage tending, not just to her own household, but to the needs of tenants, servants, and neighbors who sought her counsel. She had delivered babies, nursed the sick, and comforted the grieving. Her own childlessness had been a private sorrow, but it had led her to mother many who needed guidance and care. Now, watching the young couples begin to form for dancing, she felt the weight of her solitude more keenly than usual. The sight of joined hands and whispered endearments reminded her of Edmund's courtship, their wedding night, the quiet contentment of shared mornings and evening conversations by their own hearth. They had been blessed with 32 years together, more than many received, but it felt impossibly brief now that she faced decades of emptiness ahead. The fire crackled in the massive stone hearth, its warmth reaching even the corners of the great hall. Tapestries depicted scenes of legendary hunts and mythical creatures, their rich colors deepened by age and firelight. Above, heavy wooden beams supported the vaulted ceiling, and from them hung iron chandeliers holding dozens of candles that had been burning since sunset. As Elowen lifted her cup of wine, barely touched throughout the evening, she became aware of eyes upon her. Not the casual glances of fellow guests, but something more focused, more intense. She turned slightly, scanning the crowd with the subtle skill of someone who had learned to assess threats in a world where women always needed to be aware of their surroundings. There, standing near a pillar carved with intricate Celtic knots, she glimpsed a figure that seemed somehow separate from the celebration. Tall and lean, dressed in noble attire that suggested both wealth and refinement, he possessed an otherworldly stillness that set him apart from the jovial crowd. His pale hair caught the candlelight like spun silver, and even at this distance, she could sense an unusual intensity in his gaze. Lord Vaylen, she had heard his name mentioned in passing as some relation to the groom's family, though the exact connection remained unclear. He had arrived with the Blackmore party, but seemed to hold himself apart from even them, as if he attended out of duty rather than joy. There was something timeless about his bearing, an elegance that spoke of centuries rather than decades of refinement. Their eyes met across the crowded hall for just a moment, and Elowen felt an unexpected flutter of awareness. His gaze held neither the dismissive assessment she had grown accustomed to receiving as an older woman, nor the sympathy that made her skin crawl. Instead, she saw something like recognition, as if he understood the weight of loss that bowed her shoulders and shadowed her eyes. Then the moment passed, as Margaret called for the traditional blessing dance, and Elowen turned her attention back to the celebration, unaware that her brief exchange with the mysterious lord had awakened something ancient and long dormant in the shadows of Thornwick Castle. The peaceful atmosphere of the wedding feast shattered like glass against stone when the great oak doors burst open with a thunderous crash. Cold wind howled through the entrance, extinguishing nearby candles and sending tapestries billowing like restless spirits. The music faltered, conversations died mid-sentence, and every head turned toward the unwelcome intrusion. Gareth the Brutal stood silhouetted in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the winter night beyond. Snow clung to his dark beard and the coarse fur cloak that hung from his broad shoulders. He was a man built for violence, with arms like tree trunks and hands that had never known gentleness. His leather gauntlets, stained with old blood and newer cruelties, creaked as he flexed his fingers. Those gloves had become as notorious as their wearer, instruments of torment that had left their mark on too many innocents. "Well, well," Gareth's voice boomed across the suddenly silent hall, thick with ale and malice. "A wedding feast, and no one thought to invite old Gareth to the celebration?" His laugh was harsh as grinding stone, devoid of any warmth or humour. How terribly rude of the Thornwick family. Lord Aldrich rose slowly from the head table, his face pale but resolute. "You are not invited, Gareth, because you are not welcome in this hall. Leave now, and we will forget this interruption." Gareth's eyes glittered with dangerous amusement as he swaggered into the hall, leaving muddy boot prints on the clean rushes. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, some rising as if to flee, others reaching instinctively for weapons they had left at the door in accordance with wedding custom. The man's reputation preceded him like a foul stench. Stories of tavern brawls that left men broken, of women terrorized in their own homes, of debts collected through methods that made hardened soldiers pale. "Oh, but I have every right to be here," Gareth continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled nobles with unconcealed contempt. "After all, Lord Blackmore owes me a considerable sum from our last business arrangement. Surely the happy groom wouldn't want such debts hanging over his wedding day." Sir William stood beside his bride, one protective hand on Margaret's shoulder. "I owe you nothing, Gareth. That matter was settled months ago." "Was it?" Gareth pulled a rolled parchment from his belt, waving it mockingly. "My records suggest otherwise. But perhaps we can negotiate new terms. After all, I'm feeling generous tonight, surrounded by all this wealth and beauty." His eyes began to roam the hall with predatory interest, lingering on the younger women until they shrank back behind their fathers and husbands. This was Gareth's true purpose. Not debt collection, but the cruel sport of intimidating those who could not fight back. He fed on fear the way other men consumed wine, growing stronger and more vicious with each display of terror he inspired. The hall's warmth seemed to dissipate as Gareth moved deeper into the celebration, his presence poisoning the air like smoke from a diseased fire. Servants pressed themselves against the walls, children hid behind their mothers' skirts, and even seasoned warriors found excuses to avoid his path. Stories followed this man like ravens, tales of merchant daughters who had disappeared after catching his attention, of innkeepers beaten senseless for refusing his demands, of justice perverted by the gold he spread among corrupt officials. "Such lovely ladies gracing us tonight," Gareth mused, his voice carrying clearly in the unnatural quiet. "Surely one of them would honor me with a dance, or perhaps something more intimate." Lady Cordelia gasped audibly, pressing her hand to her throat. Margaret moved closer to her new husband, her wedding joy replaced by visible fear. Other women throughout the hall looked down at their plates, or turned away, hoping to avoid drawing the brute's attention. But Gareth seemed to savor their discomfort, his cruel smile widening as he continued his leisurely survey. Then his gaze fell upon Elowen. She sat frozen at her table, her widow's dignity making her appear isolated from the protection that surrounded other women. Her simple dress, darker than the celebratory colors around her, marked her as different, vulnerable. The empty chair beside her seemed to announce her solitude to any predator clever enough to notice. "Ah," Gareth breathed, his voice dropping to a register that somehow made it more menacing than his earlier shouts. "Now here's a beauty who sits alone. Tell me, lovely lady, where is your protector this evening?" Elowen's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her wine cup, but she kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge his attention. Years of marriage to a respected man had taught her the power of dignified silence, the way a lady could sometimes deflect unwanted advances through sheer force of propriety. But Gareth the Brutal had never respected propriety. He approached her table with deliberate slowness, his heavy boots echoing in the hushed hall. The guests at neighboring tables found sudden reasons to examine their food or engage in whispered conversations, abandoning her to face the threat alone. Even distant relatives who had shared pleasant conversation with her earlier now avoided her eyes, unwilling to draw the monster's attention to themselves. "I asked you a question, woman," Gareth said, his voice deceptively soft as he stopped directly beside her chair. The stench of unwashed flesh and stale ale washed over her like a physical blow. "It's rude to ignore a gentleman when he's speaking to you." Elowen lifted her chin slightly, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she still possessed. "I am in mourning, sir. I came here only to honor family, not to provide entertainment." Her voice remained steady despite the terror clawing at her throat, and for a moment, pride flickered in her chest. Edmund would have been proud to see her face this threat with such dignity, but her composure only seemed to inflame Gareth's cruel nature. "Mourning?" His laughter was like the sound of breaking bones. "How convenient, a widow, all alone and unprotected. Perhaps it's time you learned that life offers more than grief." Before anyone could react, his massive hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with crushing force. The delicate bones ground together beneath his grip, and Elowen couldn't suppress a sharp cry of pain and shock. Her wine cup tumbled from nerveless fingers, staining the white tablecloth crimson. The hall erupted in gasps and horrified whispers, but no one moved to intervene. Gareth's reputation for violence was too well known, his connections to corrupt officials too dangerous. Even the men who might have acted found themselves frozen between the desire to help and the knowledge that their families would suffer if they crossed this monster. "Let go of me," Elowen whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I don't think so," Gareth replied, his grip tightening until she whimpered despite her efforts to remain strong. "You've been sitting here all evening, looking so sad and lonely. I think you need someone to remind you what it feels like to be truly alive. He began to pull her from her chair, his intentions clear to everyone watching. This was no mere intimidation. This was the prelude to something far worse, something that would destroy not just Elowen, but the very soul of the celebration itself. The joy of the wedding would be forever tainted by what was about to unfold. And in the shadows near the ancient pillar, something older than the stones themselves stirred to terrible life. Lord Vaylen's pale eyes began to burn like embers in the darkness, and the temperature in the hall dropped, as if winter itself had found its way inside. The silver pendant beneath Vaylen's noble attire seemed to burn against his chest as memories crashed over him like winter waves against stone. Hidden from mortal eyes, the ancient talisman bore the delicate image of a woman whose face had haunted him for 3 centuries. Lyanna, with her gentle eyes and trusting smile, whose screams still echoed in his dreams. She had been a merchant's daughter in a long-forgotten village, and he had been merely Lord Vaylen then, a mortal man of wealth and influence who fancied himself her protector. He had courted her with all the passion of youth, promised her safety in a world that offered little to women of modest birth. But when raiders had come in the night, when brutal men had dragged her from her father's shop while he lay bleeding in the streets, Vaylen had been miles away, attending to matters he had deemed more important than love. By the time he had returned, Lyanna was dead, her broken body found in the ashes of what had once been her sanctuary. The raiders had vanished like smoke, leaving only destruction and the weight of his failure. In his rage and despair, he had sought dark powers, made bargains with entities that existed beyond the mortal realm. The vampire's curse had been both punishment and gift, eternal life with which to protect others, eternal guilt for the one he could not save. Now, centuries later, watching Gareth's brutal hands violate another innocent woman, those old wounds tore open with fresh agony. Elowen's terror-filled eyes might have been Lyanna's, her helpless struggle against superior strength, a perfect echo of that long-ago nightmare. But this time he would not fail. Vaylen moved with fluid grace through the frozen tableau of wedding guests, his supernatural nature allowing him to pass almost unnoticed despite his commanding presence. His pale skin seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it, and the air around him grew noticeably colder with each step. Those sensitive enough to perceive such things felt an ancient dread settle over them, though they could not name its source. At her table, Elowen fought against both Gareth's grip and her own rising panic. The brute's fingers dug into her wrist like iron bands, and she could feel bruises forming beneath his cruel touch. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, she found strength in memories of her late husband's teachings. A lady never surrenders her dignity, Edmund had told her during their early years of marriage, when she had worried about her modest origins among his more noble friends. Stand tall, speak clearly, and remember that true worth comes from within, not from the circumstances that surround you. Drawing upon that wisdom now, Elowen refused to collapse into hysterics despite her terror. Instead, she met Gareth's leering gaze with steady determination, her voice clear despite its tremor. You shame yourself and dishonor this celebration with your brutish behavior. Release me at once. Her composure seemed to surprise the outlaw, who was accustomed to cowering victims. For a moment, his grip loosened slightly, and she almost managed to pull free. But then his face darkened with renewed anger, and his hold tightened until she gasped with pain. You've got spirit, he growled, his breath hot against her ear as he leaned closer. I like that in a woman. makes it more interesting when you finally break. Throughout the hall, wedding guests watched in horrified fascination as the nightmare unfolded before them. Some of the younger men shifted restlessly, clearly torn between their desire to intervene and their fear of Gareth's notorious violence. Sir William half rose from his chair, his hand instinctively reaching for a sword that wasn't there, but Lady Margaret caught his arm with desperate fingers. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He'll kill you, and then what will become of us all?" Lord Aldrich stood pale and shaking at the head table, his earlier authority crumbling in the face of real evil. He had dealt with political rivals and business disputes throughout his long life, but this raw brutality was beyond his experience. The golden chalice in his hands trembled, wine sloshing over the rim to stain his ceremonial robes. "Someone must do something," Lady Cordelia sobbed, pressing her handkerchief to her lips. "We cannot simply watch this monster destroy our celebration." But who could act? The castle guards were stationed outside the hall according to tradition, and by the time they could be summoned, it would be too late. The wedding guests were nobles and merchants, not warriors, and even those with military experience hesitated to face a man who had earned his brutal reputation through countless acts of savage violence. As the moments stretched like hours, Elowen felt her strength beginning to ebb. Gareth's grip was cutting off circulation to her hand, and his greater size and strength made resistance seem futile. She thought of Edmund, lying cold in the earth, and wondered if she would soon join him in whatever peace awaited beyond this world of pain. But then she noticed the change in the air itself. The temperature in the great hall had dropped so gradually that most guests attributed their sudden shivers to fear or the open doors through which Gareth had entered. But Elowen, caught in the heart of the crisis, felt it more keenly. The warmth that had embraced the celebration was being systematically drained away, replaced by something that felt like winter moonlight made manifest. The candles began to flicker in patterns that had nothing to do with drafts from the doorway. Ancient tapestries stirred as if touched by invisible hands. Even Gareth seemed to sense that something had changed, his predatory confidence wavering slightly as he glanced around the hall with growing unease. "What manner of sorcery?" he began, then stopped as his eyes found Vaylen approaching through the crowd. The vampire lord moved like flowing water, each step precise and purposeful. His pale hair caught what little light remained, creating an ethereal halo effect that made him seem more spirit than man. The wedding guests parted before him without conscious thought, some primitive instinct warning them that they stood in the presence of something far older and more dangerous than any mortal threat. Elowen followed Gareth's gaze and felt her breath catch as she truly saw her approaching protector for the first time. There was an otherworldly beauty to his features, a perfection that spoke of centuries rather than decades. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, pale as winter ice, but burning with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to her soul. In those eyes, she glimpsed depths of sorrow that dwarfed her own recent grief, and a rage so ancient and cold that it made Gareth's brutality seem like a child's tantrum by comparison. Yet beneath the fury, she sensed something else, a desperate need for redemption that called to her own wounded heart. The hall held its collective breath as predator and protector finally faced each other across the space of a few yards, with Elowen caught between them, like a prize to be won or lost. The ceremonial chalice in Lord Aldrich's trembling hands began to tarnish before the eyes of those near enough to witness it. The blessed silver, polished to mirror brightness for his daughter's wedding, now showed dark streaks that spread like veins of corruption across its ornate surface. The wine within seemed to grow cold, and when Aldrich raised it to his lips in nervous habit, he recoiled at the metallic taste that had nothing to do with the vintage. This was no mere coincidence. The chalice had been blessed by 3 generations of holy men, sanctified for the most sacred family celebrations. Its reaction to Vaylen's presence should have alarmed those who understood such signs, but the wedding guests remained focused on the more immediate threat of Gareth's brutality, unaware that something far more ancient had awakened in their midst. Elowen's mind reeled as memories of Edmund flooded back with painful clarity. She remembered their own wedding day, how he had stood between her and a group of drunken nobles who had made crude comments about her modest origins. His hand had been gentle on her shoulder then, protective without being possessive, strong enough to shield her from harm while respecting her own dignity and strength. "A good man protects without controlling," he had told her years later, when she had asked why he never tried to restrict her movements or friendships as so many husbands did. True love seeks to guard what is precious, not to cage it. How different this moment was from that long-ago protection. Gareth's grip spoke only of ownership, of a desire to break rather than preserve. His cruel fingers had already left dark bruises on her wrist, and she could see in his eyes the promise of far worse violations to come. The contrast with Edmund's gentle strength was so stark that it made her current helplessness even more unbearable. "You're trembling," Gareth observed with obvious satisfaction, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from some bestial part of his nature. "Good. Fear makes everything more honest, don't you think? Strips away all the pretty pretenses that ladies like you use to hide your true nature." Despite her terror, Elowen found strength in her anger. "You know nothing of my nature, sir, and you understand even less about what constitutes true strength." Her words carried clearly through the hall, and several guests murmured their approval despite their fear. Margaret, still clinging to her new husband's arm, looked at Elowen with something approaching awe. Here was a woman facing unspeakable danger, with dignity intact, refusing to surrender her sense of self, even in the face of overwhelming evil. Sir William could bear the injustice no longer. Despite his bride's restraining hand, he stepped forward, his voice ringing with outraged authority. "Enough! Release Lady Ashford immediately, or face the consequences of your actions." Gareth's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. "And what consequences would those be, boy? Will you challenge me to combat? Shall we see how your wedding finery fares against real violence?" The young knight's face flushed with shame and fury, but he held his ground. "There are laws against what you're doing. Even you cannot simply assault noble ladies without consequence." "Laws?" Gareth's grip tightened on Elowen's wrist until she couldn't suppress a soft cry of pain. "I am the law in these parts, whelp. Ask any magistrate who signs his judgments with my gold. Ask any sheriff who values his family's safety." The truth of his words settled over the hall like a funeral shroud. Corruption had indeed spread its tentacles deep into the region's administration of justice, and Gareth's wealth, earned through violence and extortion, had purchased him near immunity from legal consequences. Too many officials owed their positions to his influence. Too many had seen what happened to those who opposed him. Lady Cordelia sobbed openly now, her handkerchief sodden with tears of rage and helplessness. "This is supposed to be the happiest day of our daughter's life," she whispered to her husband. "How can we allow this monster to poison it with his evil?" But even as despair seemed to settle over the wedding party, other changes were manifesting throughout the hall. The ancient candles that had burned steadily for hours began to flicker in unnatural patterns, their flames bending as if blown by winds that no one else could feel. The temperature continued its gradual descent, and several guests pulled their cloaks tighter around their shoulders, attributing their shivers to shock rather than supernatural influence. Near the great hearth, hunting hounds that had been lying peacefully began to whine and pace, their acute senses detecting presences that human perception could not grasp. The massive wolfhounds, bred for courage in the face of wild boars and wolves, now cowered with their tails between their legs, unwilling to remain in the hall despite their master's coaxing. Elowen noticed these changes with the heightened awareness that terror sometimes brings. The world around her seemed to have taken on a dreamlike quality, where normal rules no longer applied, and impossible things lurked just beyond the edge of vision. She could feel something building in the air itself, like the pressure that preceded violent thunderstorms. Through her fear and confusion, her eyes found Vaylen once more. He had moved closer during Gareth's exchange with Sir William, and now stood perhaps 10 feet away. This near, she could see details that defied rational explanation. His skin possessed a marble-like pallor that no living person should display, and his eyes held depths that seemed to stretch far beyond the confines of any mortal soul. Yet, rather than adding to her terror, his presence brought an unexpected sense of hope. There was something in his posture, protective without being aggressive, powerful without being brutish, that reminded her of Edmund's quiet strength. But where her husband had been merely mortal, this mysterious lord carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to facing threats far greater than one corrupt outlaw. Their eyes met across the space that separated them, and for a moment, Elowen felt as if she were drowning in winter starlight. His gaze held hers with gentle intensity, and she sensed a silent communication passing between them. He was telling her to be strong, to hold on just a little longer, that help was coming in forms that Gareth could never anticipate or understand. The monster holding her captive had finally noticed Vaylen's approach, and his cruel confidence began to waver as something primitive in his brain recognized a predator far deadlier than himself. The ancient candles of the hall had burned for centuries, their beeswax cores infused with prayers and blessings from generations of Thornwick celebrations. Tonight, these sacred flames began to dim and flicker as Vaylen's power stirred to wakefulness, their light retreating as if something far older than fire had claimed dominion over the great hall. The shadows deepened between the stone pillars, and what had once been a warm, welcoming space began to feel like a cathedral dedicated to darker purposes. Vaylen stood motionless as an internal war raged within his ancient soul. 3 centuries of careful concealment warred against the primal need to protect the innocent. He had spent decades learning to walk among mortals without revealing his true nature, to blend into their society, while secretly guarding the bloodlines he had sworn to preserve. The Thornwick family had been under his protection for 5 generations, though they had never known their mysterious benefactor's true identity. But watching Elowen suffer at Gareth's hands shattered his carefully maintained control. Every fiber of his supernatural being screamed for action, for the swift and terrible justice that only his kind could deliver. Yet revealing himself would mean exile from the mortal world he had grown to cherish, an end to the delicate balance he had maintained for so long. The decision crystallized as Gareth's grip tightened once more, drawing another involuntary cry from Elowen's lips. Some things were worth any sacrifice, even an eternity of renewed solitude. "You will release the lady." Vaylen's voice cut through the hall like a blade forged from winter itself. The words carried an authority that seemed to resonate in the very stones of the castle, and every person present felt them settle into their bones with supernatural weight. Gareth's head snapped around, his predatory instincts finally recognizing real danger. but his lifetime of violence and intimidation had made him reckless, unable to believe that anyone would dare challenge his dominance. "And who might you be, pretty lord, to give me orders? I am someone who has grown weary of watching brutes harm those under my protection." Vaylen's tone remained calm, almost conversational, but the temperature in the hall dropped another degree with each word he spoke. The wedding guests began to notice the supernatural cold that had little to do with the winter night beyond the walls. Lady Margaret pulled her silk cloak closer around her shoulders, while elderly Lord Aldrich found himself shivering despite the great fire that still blazed in the hearth. Children whimpered and pressed closer to their parents, their young minds more susceptible to the otherworldly dread that now permeated the celebration. "Protection?" Gareth's laugh held a note of genuine hysteria now, though he tried to maintain his swagger. "This widow has no protector, noble or otherwise. She's fair game for any man with the strength to take what he wants." Elowen felt a surge of defiant strength flow through her veins at those words. Despite her fear, despite the pain of Gareth's grip, she would not be reduced to mere property in anyone's eyes. "I am not a prize to be claimed," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. "I am a woman with my own worth, my own dignity, and my own right to choose my fate." Her words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge, and several of the younger ladies in the audience straightened their shoulders with newfound inspiration. Here was a woman facing the ultimate violation of her autonomy, yet refusing to surrender her sense of self-worth. Even in her darkest moment, she claimed her own power. Vaylen felt something shift within his cold heart as he heard Elowen's declaration. This was no helpless victim waiting for rescue, but a woman of genuine strength who deserved a protector worthy of her courage. The parallel to Lyanna was there, but so was a crucial difference. This time, he would not fail. The supernatural phenomena in the hall began to intensify as his resolve hardened. Frost started to form on the metal goblets nearest to where he stood, and the hunting dogs outside the hall began howling with primal terror. The very air seemed to thicken, as if reality itself was bending around the presence of something that belonged to an older, darker world. Sir William, emboldened by Elowen's courage and this mysterious lord's intervention, took another step forward. "Lady Ashford speaks truly. And I say again, Gareth, release her or face justice." "Justice?" Gareth's eyes darted between Vaylen and the young knight, his predator's instincts finally warning him that the hunt had somehow turned. "What justice can you offer me, boy? Your pretty wedding sword? Your noble family's influence?" But even as he spoke, his gaze kept returning to Vaylen with growing unease. There was something wrong about the pale lord's stillness, something that set every primitive alarm in Gareth's brain, shrieking warnings he couldn't quite interpret. The man didn't move like someone preparing for violence. He stood like violence itself, coiled and waiting. "The justice I offer," Vaylen said softly, "is older than your petty corruption, deeper than your shallow cruelty. It is the justice of consequence, where actions find their inevitable price." As he spoke, the candlelight continued to fade until the great hall was lit primarily by the fire in the hearth and the pale radiance that seemed to emanate from Vaylen's own form. Shadows danced across the ancient stone walls like living things, and the temperature dropped low enough that breath began to mist in the air. Elowen stared at her mysterious protector with a mixture of awe and growing understanding. Whatever he was, wherever he had come from, he represented something beyond the ordinary world's ability to contain or comprehend. She should have been terrified by this revelation, but instead felt only gratitude and a strange sense of rightness, as if this moment had been destined since the beginning of time. Gareth's grip on her wrist loosened slightly, as his attention focused entirely on the approaching threat. His lifetime of violence had given him excellent instincts for danger, and every one of them was now screaming that he faced something far beyond his ability to handle. But pride and stupidity had carried him too far down this path to retreat now, and his brutish nature knew no strategy beyond escalation. The hall waited in breathless silence as ancient power prepared to meet mortal evil, with Elowen caught between them like the prize in a game whose rules had just fundamentally changed. Elowen's late husband's cloak, the heavy winter wool that had sheltered Edmund through countless cold journeys, now served as her final shield against the encroaching nightmare. The dark fabric, worn smooth by years of faithful service, carried the faint scent of lavender and wood smoke that still reminded her of their shared hearth. It was all she had left of his protective presence, and Gareth's crude attempts to tear it from her shoulders felt like a desecration of sacred memory. Such fine cloth for a widow, Gareth sneered, his free hand grabbing at the cloak's edge. Far too rich for someone in mourning. Perhaps it's time you learned to appreciate simpler pleasures. His words carried the clear threat of what would follow once he dragged her from the hall. The fabric began to tear under his rough handling, each rip echoing through, the horrified silence like the sound of her dignity being shredded. But even as her physical defenses crumbled, something deeper within Elowen refused to break. She thought of Edmund's quiet courage, the way he had faced his final illness with such grace and dignity. If he could meet death itself without surrender, surely she could find the strength to resist this mortal monster. Drawing upon reserves she hadn't known she possessed, she spoke with a clarity that surprised even herself. "My worth is not determined by your opinion of my clothing, sir. Nor is my fate subject to your crude desires." Her words seemed to ripple through the assembled guests like stones thrown into still water. Lady Margaret, despite her fear, raised her chin with newfound determination. "The lady speaks truly. We will not stand idle while evil unfolds before us." The young bride's declaration sparked something in the other women present. Lady Cordelia stepped forward, her earlier tears replaced by maternal fury. "Margaret is right. This has gone beyond tolerance. We are not sheep to be terrorized by wolves." Even some of the men began to find their courage, shamed by the women's example. A merchant's son named Thomas, barely past his 20th year, moved closer despite his obvious fear. "There are 50 of us here, and only one of him. Surely together we can—" His brave words died as Gareth's murderous gaze fixed upon him. The young man's face went pale, but he held his ground, and others began to shift restlessly, their collective shame finally overriding individual cowardice. But Gareth had not survived years of violence by underestimating opposition. With vicious efficiency, he yanked Elowen to her feet and wrapped his free arm around her throat, using her body as a shield against the stirring crowd. The cold metal of his belt knife appeared at her ribs, its point just pricking through the fabric of her dress. "One more step from any of you," he growled, "and this noble lady will discover what her blood looks like on my blade. Is her virtue worth dying for, you fools?" The terrible logic of his threat froze the would-be rescuers where they stood. Elowen felt the knife's point against her skin and knew that he would indeed follow through on his promise. This was no mere intimidation. Gareth the Brutal had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. Yet even as despair threatened to claim her, she became aware that the supernatural changes in the hall were accelerating. The air itself seemed to thicken around them, and she could see her breath misting despite the great fire that still burned in the hearth. Frost was forming on the metal fixtures with impossible speed, and the remaining candle flames had taken on an eerie blue tinge that cast everything in ghostly illumination. Children throughout the hall began crying without apparent cause, their young spirits reacting to presences their minds could not comprehend. The hunting dogs, howling, had reached a fevered pitch, and even the horses in the courtyard could be heard whinnying with terror. Nature itself seemed to be recoiling from what was about to unfold. Vaylen's approach had become inevitable, as the flow of a river toward the sea. His pale eyes burned with cold fire now, and the very air around him seemed to shimmer with otherworldly energy. The wedding guests instinctively parted before him, some primitive part of their minds recognizing that they stood in the presence of something far older and more dangerous than any mortal threat. "You make a grave error," Vaylen said, his voice carrying easily despite its soft tone. "You assume that your knife and your brutality make you the deadliest predator in this hall. You are mistaken." Gareth pressed the blade harder against Elowen's ribs, drawing a thin line of blood that stained her dress. "Am I? Because from where I stand, pretty lord, you're just another soft noble who's never had to fight for anything real. One more step, and I'll gut this bitch like a fish." The crude threat hung in the air like a physical presence, and for a moment, even the supernatural cold seemed to pause. Then Vaylen smiled, and that expression was more terrifying than any rage could have been. It was the smile of something that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, that had walked through centuries of human folly and found it all rather amusing. "You speak of fighting," Vaylen murmured, and his words seemed to echo from the very stones themselves. "Tell me, Gareth the Brutal, what do you know of real predators? What experience do you have with creatures that hunt in the darkness between heartbeats, that feed on more than mere flesh?" The temperature plummeted another degree, and now everyone in the hall could see their breath. The frost on the metal surfaces began spreading across the stone walls themselves, creating patterns that looked disturbingly like ancient runes. Even the fire in the great hearth seemed to bend away from Vaylen's presence, its flames taking on that same unnatural blue tinge as the dying candles. Elowen felt Gareth's arm tighten around her throat as fear finally began to penetrate his brutish confidence. His knife hand trembled slightly, though whether from cold or terror, she could not tell. But she could sense the change in him, the way his predatory certainty was crumbling in the face of something his limited understanding could not categorize or comprehend. The moment of truth was approaching like winter storm, and the great hall of Thornwick Castle was about to witness justice of a kind that belonged to legends rather than the mortal world. With deliberate slowness, Vaylen reached beneath his noble attire and withdrew a signet ring that had remained hidden for 3 centuries. The ancient band bore the mark of House Drakmore, a family name that existed now only in the most forbidden texts, a vampire lineage so old that mortal historians had relegated it to myth. As the ring caught the flickering candlelight, its dark metal seemed to absorb the illumination rather than reflect it, and the carved symbol of a bat-winged serpent appeared to writhe with life of its own. Lord Aldrich's face went ashen as recognition dawned. As keeper of the family's oldest records, he alone among the wedding guests understood the true significance of that accursed seal. His ancestors had served the Drakmore line as mortal allies centuries ago, before the family had vanished into legend and nightmare. The sight of that ring meant impossible things, that the old stories were true, that creatures of darkness still walked among them, and that the mysterious Lord Vaylen was far more than any mortal man. "Impossible," Aldrich whispered, his voice barely audible above the supernatural wind that had begun to howl through the hall, despite the closed doors and shuttered windows. The Drakmore line ended centuries ago. They were destroyed, wiped from the earth by holy fire and blessed steel. Vaylen's smile held depths of sorrow that no mortal could fathom. Destroyed? No, Lord Thornwick. We simply learned to walk more carefully among the living, to guard rather than rule, to protect rather than pray. But some things, some injustices, still call forth the ancient blood. The revelation sent shock waves through the assembled guests as the full magnitude of what they were witnessing began to sink in. Here was no mere nobleman intervening in a dispute, but a creature of legend, a vampire whose very existence rewrote everything they thought they knew about the world. Some guests fell to their knees in terror, while others pressed themselves against the walls as if stone could offer protection against supernatural wrath. Margaret clutched her new husband's arm with desperate fingers, her wedding joy transformed into primal fear. "William, what is he? What does this mean?" Sir William's face had gone pale as winter moonlight, but his voice remained steady. "It means we are witnessing something that belongs to the realm of legend, my love. And it means that Lady Ashford has found a protector unlike any other in this mortal world." Gareth's crude confidence crumbled entirely as the full implications crashed over him like an avalanche. His knife hand shook violently now, and the arm around Elowen's throat loosened as terror overwhelmed his brutal instincts. He had faced knights in battle, had murdered innocent civilians without remorse, had stood against overwhelming odds, driven by sheer vicious will. But this was beyond any evil he understood or could hope to combat. "You're lying," he gasped, though his voice carried no conviction. "Vampires are tales for children, stories to frighten the gullible. You're just some mad lord playing at being a monster." Vaylen's form began to change as he allowed his true nature to manifest fully. His already pale skin took on an alabaster translucence that seemed to glow with inner light. His canine teeth elongated into genuine fangs that gleamed like ivory daggers in the dying candlelight. Most unnaturally of all, his shadow began to move independently of his body, reaching across the floor like grasping tendrils of living darkness. "Do I appear to be playing, Gareth?" The vampire's voice had taken on harmonics that no human throat could produce, echoing with the weight of centuries and the promise of eternal judgment. "I have walked this earth since before your grandfather's grandfather drew breath. I have seen empires rise and fall, watched heroes become legends, and legends fade to dust. And in all that time, I have learned to recognize true evil when I encounter it." The temperature in the hall dropped so drastically that wine began to freeze in abandoned goblets, and the breath of every person present formed thick clouds of vapor. The great fire in the hearth guttered and died despite the abundance of fuel, leaving only Vaylen's supernatural radiance to illuminate the scene. Frost covered every metal surface now, and ice began to form on the stone walls themselves. Elowen, caught between monster and protector, felt an unexpected calm settle over her terror-racked mind. The knife at her ribs seemed almost trivial now compared to the cosmic forces at play around her. She was witnessing something that belonged to the realm of epic tales and ancient ballads, and despite her fear, she felt honored to stand at the center of such a moment. More importantly, she recognized the careful restraint in Vaylen's display of power. For all his supernatural might, he was being extraordinarily careful not to harm the innocent guests caught in this confrontation. His fury was laser-focused on Gareth alone, and she could sense the centuries of discipline that allowed him to control such ancient rage. "You want this bitch so badly?" Gareth snarled, his voice cracking with hysteria as he pressed the knife harder against Elowen's ribs. "Come and take her, demon. But know that she dies with me if you try your tricks." The threat hung in the air like a physical presence, and for a moment even the supernatural wind seemed to pause. Then Vaylen laughed, and the sound was like silver bells tolling for the damned. It held no warmth, no human humor, only the amusement of a predator who had just heard prey threaten to destroy itself rather than be caught. "You still do not understand," Vaylen said softly, his words carrying clearly despite their whispered tone. "You think in terms of mortal limitations, of human speeds and earthly physics. Allow me to demonstrate the futility of threatening those under my protection." What happened next occurred faster than human perception could follow. One moment, Gareth stood with his knife pressed against Elowen's ribs, confident in his ability to harm her before any rescue could arrive. The next moment, the blade was gone from his hand, and he found himself sprawled on the floor 10 feet away, his arm twisted at an angle that suggested multiple broken bones. Elowen remained exactly where she had been, unharmed and untouched, as if she had never been in danger at all. The knife lay embedded in a wooden beam overhead, driven so deep that only the hilt remained visible. And Vaylen stood beside her, with one protective hand on her shoulder, having moved faster than sight itself to disarm the brute and spirit her to safety. The wedding guests erupted in gasps and cries of amazement, their terror mixing with awe at the display of supernatural power. Here was justice delivered with impossible speed and precision, protection manifested through abilities that belonged to the realm of miracles and divine intervention. Gareth struggled to his feet, cradling his shattered arm against his chest, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. The invincible brute who had terrorized the region through sheer physical dominance now cowered before a being whose power made mortal strength seem like a child's toy. "What are you?" he whispered. And for the first time in his violent life, Gareth the Brutal experienced true helplessness. From beneath his midnight blue cloak, Vaylen withdrew an ornate dagger that seemed to drink in what little light remained in the hall. The blood oath blade had been forged in the earliest days of his vampiric existence, its steel quenched in waters blessed by forgotten gods, and inscribed with runes that glowed with pale fire whenever vampire honor was invoked. The ancient symbols began to pulse with increasing intensity as Vaylen's supernatural nature reached its full manifestation, casting eerie shadows across his alabaster features. The dagger was more than a weapon. It was a ceremonial tool used to exact justice, according to the oldest vampire laws, a blade that had tasted the blood of oath-breakers and those who violated the ancient codes of protection. Its very presence in the mortal world signified that judgment was about to be rendered according to rules far older than human civilization. Gareth scrambled backward across the stone floor, his broken arm clutched against his chest, leaving a trail of blood from wounds he didn't remember receiving. The confident brute who had terrorized the countryside for years was reduced to a whimpering animal, finally understanding that he faced something beyond his capacity to fight or intimidate. His reputation, his physical strength, his network of corrupt protectors, none of it mattered against a creature that existed outside the mortal world's rules. "Please," he gasped, his voice breaking like an adolescent's. "I meant no real harm. It was just sport, just a bit of fun with a willing widow. Surely that's not worth—" Silence. Vaylen's word carried supernatural compulsion that literally sealed Gareth's lips, preventing any further lies or excuses. The vampire's pale eyes blazed with cold fire as he surveyed the pathetic creature who had dared to violate those under his protection. You speak of willing participation when the lady's bruises tell a different story. You claim sport when your intent was violation and degradation. Your words only compound your sins. The wedding guests watched in horrified fascination as supernatural justice prepared to unfold before their eyes. Many had fallen to their knees, whether in prayer or terror, while others pressed themselves against the walls as if proximity to the vampire lord might prove fatal. Children sobbed in their mothers' arms, and even the bravest men found their hands shaking as they witnessed power beyond their comprehension. Yet alongside their fear, many felt a deep satisfaction building in their hearts. How many times had they watched Gareth and men like him escape consequences for their actions? How often had wealth and corruption allowed monsters to walk free while their victims suffered in silence? Here, finally, was justice that could not be bought, influenced, or intimidated. Lord Aldrich stepped forward despite his terror, his voice trembling but determined. Lord Vaylen, or whatever your true name might be, I recognize the debt my family owes yours from generations past. Our records speak of protection given freely, of darkness held at bay by your vigilance. If this is our reckoning, we accept it with gratitude. Vaylen's expression softened slightly as he regarded the elderly lord. You owe no debt, Aldrich of Thornwick. Your ancestors served with honor, and their bloodline has remained pure of the corruptions that poison lesser men. Tonight's intervention comes not from obligation, but from choice, the choice to protect innocence wherever I find it threatened. The vampire's supernatural senses detected every heartbeat in the hall, every tremor of fear or excitement that coursed through the assembled mortals. But it was Elowen's steady pulse that drew his primary attention, her remarkable composure in the face of otherworldly revelation. She stood beside him with dignity intact, her earlier terror replaced by something approaching wonder. You saved me, she said quietly, her words meant for him alone, though the supernatural acoustics carried them clearly to every ear. But at what cost to yourself? Surely revealing your nature puts you in terrible danger. Her concern for his welfare, even after witnessing his true nature, touched something in Vaylen's ancient heart that he had thought long dead. Here was a woman who could look upon a vampire with compassion rather than fear, who worried about his safety even as she stood in the presence of supernatural power that could reshape reality itself. Some things are worth any price, he replied, his voice gentle, despite the otherworldly harmonics that colored every syllable. The protection of innocence, the prevention of evil, the chance to redeem old failures through new choices. You remind me of why I chose this path centuries ago. Margaret, still clinging to her new husband's arm, found courage to speak through her tears. Will you kill him? Will we witness murder at my wedding feast? Vaylen considered the question with the gravity it deserved, his pale gaze never leaving Gareth's huddled form. Murder implies the taking of innocent life. What I contemplate is justice, the rendering of consequences that mortal law has failed to provide. But the exact nature of that justice remains to be determined. The blood oath. Blade pulsed brighter in response to his words, its ancient runes spelling out concepts in a language that predated human civilization. Justice, protection, redemption. The blade itself seemed eager to taste the blood of one who had violated every code the vampire lords held sacred. Sir William, emboldened by his new wife's question, stepped forward with careful dignity. "If I may speak, my lord, Gareth's crimes extend far beyond what we witnessed here tonight. His victims number in the dozens, perhaps hundreds. Women who disappeared after catching his attention, men beaten senseless for opposing him, children left fatherless by his violence. The corruption that protects him has allowed evil to flourish unchecked." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd as others found courage to add their voices to the litany of Gareth's crimes. A merchant spoke of extortion and theft. A farmer's wife whispered of friends who had vanished after refusing the brute's advances. A young knight recounted witnessing beatings that had left good men crippled for life. The weight of testimony seemed to press down upon the hall like a physical presence, and even those who might have counseled mercy found themselves remembering the faces of Gareth's victims. This was not merely about one night's violence, but about years of unpunished evil, a cancer that had been allowed to spread through their society because wealth and fear had corrupted the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. Gareth himself could only listen in horror as the full scope of his crimes was laid bare before supernatural judgment. His magical compulsion prevented speech, but his eyes darted frantically around the hall, seeking some escape that did not exist. He was trapped as surely as if iron chains bound him, held in place by power that made physical restraints seem like gossamer threads. The supernatural phenomena in the hall continued to intensify as Vaylen's power reached its peak. Frost covered every surface now, creating a winter landscape within the stone walls. The very air seemed to thicken with otherworldly energy, and sensitive individuals claimed they could hear whispers in ancient languages echoing from the shadows themselves. Elowen, standing at the center of this supernatural storm, felt a strange peace settling over her troubled heart. For months since Edmund's death, she had struggled with questions about justice and divine providence, wondering how a benevolent God could allow good people to suffer while evil flourished. But witnessing this moment of cosmic balance being restored, she began to understand that justice operated on scales far grander than human perception could encompass. The vampire lord raised the blood oath blade, its runes now blazing with light that seemed to pierce straight through to the soul. The moment of judgment had arrived, and every person present understood that they were about to witness something that would mark them forever. An intervention by powers that dwelt beyond the mortal realm, a reckoning that would redefine their understanding of justice itself. In the absolute silence that followed, even Gareth's labored breathing seemed to echo like thunder, and the fate of one brutal man hung balanced on the edge of eternity. The supernatural confrontation began not with violence, but with something far more terrifying: absolute silence. Vaylen moved with inhuman grace across the frost-covered floor, his footsteps making no sound, despite the ice that cracked beneath the weight of mortal guests. The blood oath blade caught what little light remained in the hall, its ancient runes pulsing with increasing intensity as vampire justice prepared to unfold. Gareth tried desperately to scramble backward, but his broken arm and the supernatural cold had stolen much of his strength. More importantly, Vaylen's presence seemed to exert a gravitational pull on the very air itself, making retreat impossible. The brute who had terrorized innocents for years now faced the ultimate predator, and every instinct he possessed screamed warnings his rational mind refused to accept. "You have spent your life believing that strength grants the right to harm others," Vaylen said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the bones of every person present. "Tonight, you will learn what true strength looks like." The vampire's form blurred with supernatural speed, and suddenly He stood directly before the cowering outlaw. Gareth found himself lifted from the floor by a grip that felt like marble carved into the shape of fingers, impossibly strong, utterly unyielding, and cold as winter stone. His feet dangled uselessly as he was held aloft with casual ease, his considerable bulk meaningless against vampiric power. "Please," Gareth managed to whisper through the magical compulsion that had sealed his lips. "I'll leave. I'll never return. I'll trouble no one again." Vaylen's pale eyes burned with cold fire as he considered the plea. Around them, the wedding guests watched in breathless terror and fascination. Here was justice being delivered by something beyond their comprehension, protection manifested through power that belonged to legend rather than reality. "Your promises carry no weight," the vampire replied softly. "I have heard such words from your kind before, spoken in moments of desperation when consequence finally overtakes action. They are as empty as the wind." With deliberate precision, Vaylen extended one alabaster finger and pressed it to Gareth's forehead. The touch carried supernatural compulsion that made the earlier silencing seem gentle by comparison. Suddenly, the brute's entire life flashed before his own eyes in vivid, horrible detail. Every act of cruelty, every moment of terrorizing innocence, every choice to inflict pain rather than show mercy. But more than just seeing his crimes, Gareth experienced them from his victims' perspectives. He felt the terror of every woman he had threatened, the helplessness of every man he had beaten, the despair of every family he had torn apart. The emotional weight of decades of cruelty crashed down upon his consciousness like an avalanche, and he began to sob with genuine anguish for the first time in his adult life. The transformation was visible to everyone watching. The cruel confidence that had defined Gareth the Brutal crumbled away, replaced by something raw and broken. His sobs echoed through the hall, and several guests found themselves weeping in response to the sound of such profound remorse. "Do you see?" Vaylen asked, his grip never loosening despite the outlaw's collapse. "Do you understand the weight of what you have done? This is justice, not merely punishment, but comprehension. True consequence requires understanding." Gareth's tears were freezing on his cheeks before they could fall, but he continued to weep as the full magnitude of his life's evil work settled into his soul. For the first time, he truly grasped the scope of suffering he had caused, and the knowledge was almost unbearable. Yet Vaylen was not finished. With supernatural precision, he pricked his own finger on the blood oath blade's edge, allowing 3 drops of his ancient blood to fall onto the stone floor. Where the crimson liquid touched the frost-covered ground, it glowed with silver radiance that seemed to purify everything around it. The very stones appeared cleaner, somehow sanctified by contact with blood that carried centuries of honor and protection. "By the old laws," Vaylen intoned, his words echoing with ritual power, "I mark this ground as sacred. Let all who witness understand that justice has been served, that protection has been rendered, and that the innocent need fear no more." The silver glow spread outward from those 3 precious drops, creating a circle of sanctification around the entire confrontation. Within that blessed space, evil could find no purchase, and truth shone with undeniable clarity. Even the most cynical guests could feel the rightness of what was unfolding, the cosmic balance being restored through supernatural intervention. Gareth's sobs gradually quieted as the vampire's compulsion released him from the vision of his crimes. But the knowledge remained, carved into his consciousness like scars that would never heal. When he looked up at Vaylen now, his eyes held not just fear, but something approaching gratitude, the recognition that he had been given a terrible gift of understanding. What happens? Now, he whispered, his voice broken and small. Vaylen's expression softened slightly, though his grip remained firm. Now, Gareth of Nowhere, you face a choice that will define whatever remains of your existence. The iron chain that Gareth wore around his neck, a grotesque trophy marking each life he had destroyed, began to glow with supernatural heat. The crude links, forged from metal stained with the blood of his victims, started to crack and splinter as Vaylen's power focused upon this symbol of mortal cruelty. Each link represented a soul broken by the brute's violence, and now the chain itself became the instrument of his judgment. With a sound like thunder splitting stone, the chain shattered completely. The broken pieces fell to the frost-covered floor with musical chimes, each fragment glowing briefly with silver light before crumbling to harmless dust. The symbol of Gareth's power over others was destroyed as utterly as if it had never existed, and with its destruction came the final breaking of his cruel dominance. Gareth gasped as the chain's weight lifted from his shoulders, not just the physical burden, but the spiritual darkness it had represented. For years, that grotesque trophy had been his pride, his visible proof of superiority over those too weak to defend themselves. Now, without its familiar presence, he felt strangely hollow, as if a fundamental part of his identity had been torn away. "Your reign of terror ends here," Vaylen declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. "But I offer you something your victims never received, a choice in how your story concludes." The vampire's grip loosened slightly, though not enough to allow escape. Around them, the wedding guests leaned forward despite their fear, understanding that they were witnessing the culmination of something far greater than simple revenge. This was cosmic justice being balanced, the restoration of order to a world where evil had been allowed to flourish too long. "You may choose death," Vaylen continued, his pale eyes boring into Gareth's soul. "Quick and clean, an end to the torment of understanding what you have become. Many would call this mercy, considering the scope of your crimes." Gareth's breath came in ragged gasps as he contemplated that offer. Death would indeed be merciful, an escape from the crushing weight of newfound conscience that threatened to drive him mad. But something in the vampire's tone suggested there was more to this choice than simple execution. "Or," Vaylen said softly, "you may choose redemption, a path infinitely harder than death, requiring you to dedicate whatever remains of your life to undoing the damage you have caused. You would become what you have always despised, a protector of the innocent, a guardian of those who cannot defend themselves." The offer struck the assembled guests like a physical blow. Redemption? For a monster like Gareth? Several voices rose in protest, demanding that justice mean death rather than mercy. But Vaylen raised one pale hand, and supernatural compulsion settled over the hall like a gentle but irresistible blanket. "True justice," the vampire explained, his words carrying clearly to every ear, "seeks not merely to punish evil, but to transform it. Death is final, offering no opportunity for growth or change. But redemption requires the monster to become the hero, to use his strength to protect rather than harm." Elowen found herself stepping forward, despite the supernatural atmosphere that surrounded the confrontation. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a clarity that surprised even herself. If he chooses redemption, how can we trust that his change is genuine? How do we know this isn't merely another deception? Vaylen's expression softened as he regarded her, and for a moment the ancient sorrow in his eyes was visible to all. "Because, dear lady, I will ensure his transformation is complete. The blood oath I performed has bound him to truth. He cannot lie or deceive while its power holds. If he chooses redemption, he will spend every remaining day of his life making amends, and I will be watching to ensure his commitment never wavers." Gareth looked up at his supernatural captor with something approaching wonder. After a lifetime of believing that strength meant the right to dominate others, he was being offered the chance to use that same strength for protection rather than harm. The irony was not lost on him. The monster he had always been could become the guardian he had never imagined. "Why?" he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Why offer mercy to someone who has shown none to others?" "Because," Vaylen replied, his words carrying the weight of centuries of regret, "I once failed to protect someone precious to me. I have spent lifetimes seeking to redeem that failure through the protection of others. Perhaps you too can find meaning in transformation rather than destruction." The hall waited in breathless silence as Gareth wrestled with the most important decision of his life: death or redemption, an end to suffering or a lifetime of atonement. The choice would define not only his fate, but the very nature of justice itself. Finally, with tears still freezing on his cheeks, Gareth made his decision. "I choose—" The words hung in the supernatural air, like prayers waiting for divine acknowledgement, and every soul present understood that they were witnessing the transformation of a monster into something entirely new. "I choose redemption." The words fell into the supernatural silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of consequence that would spread far beyond this single night. As Gareth spoke his decision, the silver light from Vaylen's blood grew brighter, accepting the oath and sealing the transformation that would define the rest of his mortal existence. Vaylen lowered the broken man to his feet with careful gentleness, then withdrew a delicate silver amulet from beneath his cloak. The protective charm was intricately wrought with symbols that seemed to shift and flow in the ethereal light, ancient runes that spoke of sanctuary, honor, and the sacred duty to guard innocence. It had been crafted centuries ago for another purpose, but tonight it would serve as a tangible reminder of the choice made in this hallowed moment. "Lady Ashford," the vampire said, turning toward Elowen with something approaching reverence. "This is for you, a token of protection that will ensure your safety wherever you may journey. But more than that, it represents something far more precious: the recognition of your inherent worth, your dignity, and your right to walk through this world without fear." Elowen accepted the amulet with trembling hands, feeling the warmth that emanated from its ancient silver. As the chain settled around her neck, she experienced a profound shift in her understanding of herself. No longer was she merely Edmund's widow, defined by loss and existing in the shadow of grief. She had become something new, a woman who had faced the ultimate violation of her dignity and emerged not broken, but transformed. "Thank you," she whispered, her words carrying depths of meaning that encompassed far more than gratitude for rescue. She was thanking him for seeing her as worthy of protection, for treating her as a person of value rather than a burden to be endured, for showing her that even in her darkest moment, she was not alone in the world. The supernatural cold that had gripped the hall began to recede as Vaylen's power withdrew to more manageable levels. Candles flickered back to life throughout the great chamber, and the frost on the walls melted away like morning dew touched by sunlight. Yet something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere. The very air seemed cleaner, purified by the supernatural justice that had unfolded within these ancient stones. Gareth knelt in the center of the hall, no longer the feared brute who had terrorized the countryside, but something entirely new, a man reborn through the recognition of his own capacity for both evil and redemption. The physical pain of his broken arm seemed insignificant compared to the spiritual weight of his transformation, and when he looked up at the assembled guests, his eyes held not defiance, but humble acceptance of the difficult path ahead. "I will spend every remaining day of my life making amends," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that no one could doubt. "I cannot undo the harm I have caused, but I can ensure that no other innocent suffers as my victims have suffered. This I swear before witnesses both mortal and eternal." Sir William stepped forward, his young face grave with the weight of what he had witnessed. "The law will still require satisfaction for your crimes, Gareth. Redemption does not erase the need for justice through mortal courts." "I understand," Gareth replied without hesitation. "I will surrender myself to proper authorities and accept whatever punishment the law demands. But I ask only that, when my earthly debts are paid, I be allowed to serve those who need protection." Lord Aldrich, still pale from the revelations of the evening, found his voice at last. "The Thornwick family will ensure that your transformation is genuine and your service meaningful. If Lord Vaylen vouches for your redemption, then we will support your efforts to make amends." Vaylen nodded his acceptance of this arrangement, then turned to address the assembled wedding guests. The supernatural aura around him had softened to something almost gentle, though his otherworldly nature remained unmistakable. "What you have witnessed tonight must be remembered not as a tale of supernatural intervention, but as a reminder that justice exists beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding. Evil may flourish for a time, but consequence is inevitable, and redemption remains possible for those willing to embrace transformation." Margaret, still shaken but finding strength in her new husband's presence, stepped forward with remarkable courage. "Lord Vaylen, will you stay for the remainder of our celebration? After what has transpired, it seems fitting that our wedding feast should honor both justice and mercy." The vampire's ancient features softened into something approaching a smile. "I am honored by your invitation, Lady Margaret, but my presence here has already attracted more attention than is wise. The shadows will welcome me back, and from there I will continue my vigil over those who need protection." As if to demonstrate his words, Vaylen began to fade like morning mist touched by sunlight. His form became translucent, then gradually invisible, until only his voice remained to offer final words of blessing and protection. "Remember this night, all of you. Remember that strength exists not to dominate others, but to guard what is precious. And remember that even the darkest soul can find its way to light if the choice is made with genuine conviction." The great hall of Thornwick Castle slowly returned to its celebratory atmosphere, though the wedding feast would never be remembered as a simple joining of two houses. It had become something far more significant, a witness to supernatural justice, a testament to the possibility of redemption, and a reminder that even in a world where evil seemed to flourish unchecked, ancient powers still watched over the innocent. Elowen touched the silver amulet at her throat, feeling not just its protective properties, but the transformation it represented. She was no longer invisible, no longer defined solely by loss. She had been seen, valued, and defended by forces beyond mortal understanding. As the celebration resumed around them, she knew that tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new purpose, and perhaps most importantly, the understanding that her worth had never depended on others' recognition. It had always existed, waiting only for the right moment to be acknowledged and celebrated.